This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/JavaScript Jabber. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Aimee Knight.
Hello from Nashville, Tennessee.
Corey House.
Hello from Kansas City.
Joe Eames.
Hello from my basement.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Dirk Hohndel. Now, I'm just going to give a little bit of background, and then you can give us a more in-depth introduction, but I met Dirk at VMworld this year. He is the VP of open source. Did I get that right?
Chief open source officer, yes.
Yeah, something like that. Open source, something important at VMware. So anyway, we had quite a chat at VMworld, but my equipment wasn't working. I was going to do an interview. So I was like, hey, well, why don't you come on the show? We'll talk about open source. We'll talk about open source at a big company and just, have a conversation with, some of my friends who do JavaScript as well. So that's why you're here. Now, you've been involved in open source for a while. So do you want to kind of give us a little bit of background beyond VMware?
Yeah, so I've been doing open source for about 28 plus years, long before it was actually called open source, which is also about 20 years ago. I was one of the first Linux kernel developers. I was the CTO at SUSE. I ran x86. Last decade and a half, I spent at Intel, being their chief Linux and open source technologist, and starting a lot of the stuff that Intel has done in open source since. A year and a half ago, I joined VMware, and I'm now the chief open source officer at VMware, helping the company be more inclusive and more part of the broader development community, and overall more successful in an industry that more and more shifts towards open source as one of the pillars of how software is developed.
Gotcha. So the other question I just want to give people a little bit more background on is, what does a chief open source officer do?
I don't think there are a lot of chief open source officers. So most companies that have an open source program office that tends to be at the director level, sometimes even more junior than that. But as you get older and as your hairline goes higher and higher on your forehead, the career aspirations obviously change as well. And so when I started talking to VMware, and we talked about, so what does it mean? What should I be doing? What is my role? And it became very clear that the role is very strategic. It's very critical to a company to have a solid grasp of how to engage with the open source communities in general, but also how to use open source as part of what we do in our product development, in our outreach to developers, in our conversation with partners, and increasingly so in our conversation with our customers. And so given the strategic nature of the role and the cross-company nature of the role, it ended up being a VP role. And for very complicated and silly reasons, I ended up with this title of a chief open source officer. And at first I said, this is weird. I've always been a CTO technologist kind of dude, but I've grown used to it and I kind of like it. It's different.
I'd love to, before we get into more talking about open source, just kind of ask you some historical questions. I love talking to people that have been in the industry for a long time. So okay. What do you think, looking at where we are now, what do you think is really, really different from when you kind of got started? And what do you think has stayed the same?
So when I got started, computing was unbelievably simple. I always tell people when I started working on the Linux kernel, I printed out the complete kernel sources. I don't recommend doing this today.
Wow.
We were talking about maybe 100 pages of, oh, by the way, not a laser, but a line printer, because, we're talking 1991. So your computer, when I had my first computer, a VIC-20, had 3 kilobytes of RAM. That's kilobytes with a K. And my first hard drive was a 5 megabyte hard drive. So what has changed is very much the complexity of everything that we do. It used to be that because of the extremely limited resources that you had, your software was incredibly simplistic. A program that linked more than 3 libraries, you would link the C library, the math library, and
now we look
that
at
was it.
modules. It's like modules.
Yeah, your standard library does more than that now.
I had this conversation the other day with a recent graduate that was interviewing with me, and I said, so how big is a Hello World program? And he said, oh, it's small, it's 5-8 megabytes, it's not big. I'm like, think about this. The only thing this program does is it writes the words "Hello World" on the screen, and that's 5 megabytes. What's wrong with this? That should be 70, 80 instructions maybe. So I think what has changed is the complexity has gone up unbelievably. And because of that, in a way, it's gotten easier to get started because you have these incredibly powerful tools and all these support libraries. And it's very, very easy to do really, really bad things because you can architect yourself into a place you really never wanted to be. And you can so quickly get confused by the infrastructure that you're using. And we're seeing this every day in projects that things that should be incredibly simple turn out to be incredibly fragile and complicated and have unbelievably stupid security vulnerabilities. Complexity has gone up, and that has made things easier and has made things harder. In so many ways, I think it's harder to get started today and to learn actually how to write.
That's interesting.
Well, one thing that they shouldn't do to save space is try to only store 2 digits on the year. I know that for sure.
This is such an interesting question because the reason why 2 digits were saved on the year wasn't all about space. It was about lack of vision. So there are actually transcripts of old discussions that say, no one will run this in 30 years. Who cares? and
Yep.
you're okay, but we're all laughing about this now. But now you're talking about people about 32-bit time T. And they say 2037. You're kidding, right? Who cares? This is just 20 years away. This is as far ahead of us as 2000 is behind us. We are almost there.
Sometimes, like when I write tests and I say like this application, there's no way this code's going to be around in like 20 years, and I write my dates for like 20 years in the future or something. Like if this application is still around by then, these tests deserve to fail. Saying that maybe it'll still be around.
But see, I have this wonderful conversation with embedded people. So how old is your car? Or how old is the oldest car on the block that you live on? I'm sure
that's mine.
Car.
It's still mine.
20 years.
Yeah, mine's about 15 years old.
Mine's 22 years old.
Yeah, exactly. And if I go down very 2 blocks from my house, there is a beautiful Datsun, which I think is a 78. It's a gorgeous car.
Yeah.
So the technology that was built in 78 still works 40 years later. Now, today, all new cars have 20, 30, 40 embedded computers in them. How many of them are designed to still work reliably in 40 years?
Very interesting. So what do you think has stayed the same, though? Anything?
A lot has stayed the same. What has stayed the same is the good engineering matters. That the more you as a developer think through what you're doing, the more you have a vision of what is the desired outcome, and you stick to it. You don't fall for feature creepism. And the more you understand how to architect that, how to layer this, how to use the tools that are available to you, but fundamentally how to write software that stays simple, that stays debuggable. One of my pet peeves is people who write software that they themselves 6 months later don't understand. Problem in the 90s, and that's a problem today.
So I'd like to jump in here and note that my most popular tweet ever is a tweet that says there are 100 million. I got this figure from Bob, Uncle Bob,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Martin. So there's 100 million lines of code running the average modern car. And my tweet says this should scare any experienced programmer, which
Yes.
I highly agree with.
Terrifies me.
Yes.
Absolutely terrifies
100 million lines of code, and being a programmer, you know what that means, right? The defect rate.
Have you seen there's a beautiful meme about people riding the Tesla autopilot or driving with the Tesla autopilot. And there's the picture, and those of us who are on video for this call, there's the picture with the dude who leans back, crosses his arms, and the car is driving. And you say, yeah, that's a marketing professional. And then there's the other one who just is completely freaked out, and the hands are on the steering wheel, and he's constantly looking what's going on. That's a software developer. Because you think, this is software similar to the software that I write, and this is driving a 4,500-pound car at 80 miles an hour down a busy freeway. That is such an incredibly frightening thought. Because yes, this is millions of lines of code, and with the average defect density, and anybody who has driven in a Tesla and has seen their UI knows how high that defect density is. Really scary.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious. You know, we're talking a little bit about just software in general. Do you find that people approach open source a little bit differently, or do we have some of the same issues, right? With, oh, well, you know, this is used in, I mean, like the Linux kernel, for example. You mentioned that you worked on the Linux kernel. You know, that's used on all kinds of machines. A lot of that code runs on my MacBook Pro that I'm talking to you on now. You know, it's used all over the world to run all kinds of stuff. Many versions of Linux, you know, with a whole bunch of stuff stripped out, is running in IoT and embedded devices. So since this is everywhere, right? It's in everything, and it's in more stuff every day. Is that just as frightening?
So let's start a little bit with the licensing. I really hope that your MacBook Pro itself isn't running in the Linux code, and otherwise Apple is in a bit of trouble.
Well, they're running the BSD kernel, but a lot of the software, I see a lot of similarities. You know.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, if you look at not just Linux, the kernel, but you look at the open source ecosystem, Macs are chock full of open source software. Absolutely. So fundamentally, open source software is a different methodology to develop software. But most importantly, it's a social experiment. It's a social phenomenon. Open source software is about the idea that people who otherwise have nothing in common can collaborate, can trust each other, can work together in a productive manner without having an organization that forces them to do so, without having a marketing department that sets product specifications, and just driven by the desire to write good software. And that is what is fundamentally different between open source software and proprietary software. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, beyond this motivation of why people engage, the things that make people a good developer are exactly the same, whether it's open source or not. And developers who have good taste, who understand architecture, who can write elegant, easy to debug algorithms are very rare. And as a result of that, if you look at the overall sum of open source projects, I think GitHub said the other day they had like 62 million projects. I'm sure by now it's 64. There is no way that these are 60 plus million projects of all excellent software. A lot of this is, shall we say, questionable. And a lot of this is software that you should never use in a production environment. But on the flip side, there are a number of incredibly good projects, and projects that are very well developed by highly skilled teams, and where the open source software certainly meets all the criteria that you would normally put on a software stack that you would run in your product. So it's a very broad range. And the biggest mistake that we always make is that we try to compare and say, oh, this is open source software as if it was one thing, when in reality it isn't. It's an incredibly huge ecosystem that ranges from 9-year-olds getting access to GitHub and posting little sample programs to the most accomplished programmers in the world, creating the most frequently used operating system kernel in the world. So it's a very wide range.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I'm hitting at, though, is that it's developed in the open, which in some ways I think makes it stronger, but it also makes it's out there so somebody can, scrub through it and maybe find vulnerabilities. The other thing is that people collaborate on open source differently in a lot of cases than they do on closed source proprietary software. And I think that changes the dynamic and the structure of the open source code a little bit. And so, I don't know. Do those things matter?
So I think they matter very, very much. And let's start with the first statement that you made about security. This is an age-old discussion. Is security through obscurity the better method? No one knows my source code, so no one can find my bugs. And I would say we have a couple of decades of remote exploits in proprietary software that say that by itself isn't good enough.
No,
and
I agree.
People saying because people see my source, they see my bugs, so it's easier to hack the software. And again, you look at the code drop from the NSA that WikiLeaks did, 6 months ago. And predominantly the targets of that code actually wasn't open source software. It was proprietary software. So while I don't blindly believe this Linus's statement that significant, enough ice make any bug shallow, we clearly have catastrophic bugs in open source software that cause us a ton of pain. But the opposite isn't true either, that by being open, you somehow expose yourself to more risks. I simply don't think that the past decade of open source being used everywhere has really led to any proof of that statement. So I think the fundamental difference in the development model is, especially if you look at the somewhat bigger projects. So the projects that are not me, my buddy, and the kid next door in the dorm, but the projects that have a broad international multi-company membership, that because of the development model, because the review steps are public, the interaction on the patches is public, there is a lot more peer pressure to pay more attention. And I think that overall, the model has proven to create really high quality software. But this comes with the flip side, because one of the things that is really, really hard to do in open source, and that very few projects have gotten a handle on, is how do you get from great code that is really good at the level that the developers tested to something that then scales to an enterprise scale. And I don't want to pick on a specific project, but let's take OpenStack. And there has always been this criticism that OpenStack works fantastically if you have 3 single U-rack systems and you have 20 VMs between the 3, they're on the same class C network, and it all works perfect. And then you try to deploy this on 1,000 machines across 3 continents in a complex network environment, and it all falls to pieces, because that's not the scenario that the developers test. Similarly, you see algorithms that are in very popular open source libraries that do fantastic if you have 10,000 data sets and you throw 10 million data sets at the algorithm and it all comes to a grinding halt. So one of the big challenges is that very often open source software is developed and tested with a mindset for the scale that the individual developer either has right in front of them or can easily envision. And the scale in which enterprise data centers run today is so incredibly scary and so incredibly different that it's not something that is tested for. And to me, the biggest hurdles, if you really look at what's happening in the industry right now in the cloud space, the biggest hurdles are network complexity. People have no understanding. No, that's not fair. It's not that they have no understanding. They don't pay enough attention to latencies, package drop rate, routing problems, network complexity, switching between IPv4, IPv6, having NAT in the middle, all that. So network complexity. And then the complexity of having persistent storage. And this is not just in cloud applications. This is in most every application in the server side. On the desktop, it's easy. Every OS has their persistent settings, the registry, the Apple's plist files, whatever. So the moment you go to something that is is data center driven, you have to think about persistent storage. Most every project thinks about this as, oh, I'm running on a system and there's a hard drive attached. And, if I do a HA, there is maybe something like etcd or something. And then you apply this at enterprise scale and you have 1,000 machines involved, and you again have distributed data centers involved. And there isn't a simple shared storage available. And a lot of projects fall down. So to me, this is really scale in the sense of performance, obviously, scale in the sense of network complexity, scale in the sense of how does persistent storage work. Those are the areas where open source software often falls down.
That's interesting. I've just had clients in the past that, we're comfortable with this open source software and this other open source software, but everything else scares us to death. And so, I kind of had to ask the question because I wanted to see, where should we be worried? What are the thought processes behind this?
In some ways, I fall back to my earlier position. Open source software and proprietary software are no different.
Right.
Complexity is hard. Scale is hard. But where I'm more concerned is whenever software that was developed for a certain set of problems, a certain scale, a certain environment with a certain set of assumptions is now taken out of that and moved into a completely different space. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that happens maybe a little more easily in open source. Because in a software company, the people who wrote the code, if now their manager says, oh, by the way, now instead of 10 machines, we're using 1,000, it's likely that the engineers say, maybe that n-squared algorithm over there isn't the best way to do that. Mm-hmm. But if developer X over here wrote that code, thinking this is going to scale up to about 10 nodes, and that's what it's optimized for, and developer Y, somewhere completely different, says, I need code that does that. Oh, look, that code does it, and uses it with no context and no conversation with the original author. Then suddenly code is used way outside of its design area, design specs. And that's really where I get more nervous. It's this disconnected nature of how open source projects often grow.
Hey, Dirk, could I ask you to back up just a tiny bit and give dig in just a little bit for clarity on people who may not be familiar with Big O notation, why it matters if we have an n-squared algorithm and you scale up like that, and what it even means to have an n-squared algorithm.
Yeah, so an n-squared algorithm means that if you have n data sets, then the time it takes to process this is roughly proportional to the square of that number. So if I give you 10 data sets, 10 items, then it takes you 100 something to process that. And if I give you 100 data sets, it suddenly takes 10,000 something. So an n-squared algorithm means that the bigger your data grows, your performance goes exponentially quadratic down. And it becomes harder and harder to deal with large data sets. And literally a week ago, I was looking through a library that I was using, an open source project that I was working. And I look at this algorithm and I say, great, that's n cubed. So once we have hard 50 elements, I don't want to use this anymore. But you have to look at this with these eyes. You have to pay attention to scale. And a lot of developers don't, because a lot of developers think about their specific problem that they're solving right now. And that may be sorting 50 elements instead of 50,000.
Hey, now while we're talking about it, I'd love to get your take on just, again, to dig a little bit deeper into this same concept. There's a common, statement or piece of advice that's thrown around that premature optimization is the root of all evil. So you're talking about paying attention to scale. How do you personally guide yourself as to when do you worry about stuff like that? Are you prematurely optimizing, or are you just getting ready to be scalable?
So what's this question for?
For you, Dirk. This is for you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think that it is very important when you write algorithms that you document your assumptions. And this is what I said earlier. You need to write maintainable code. You need to write down, what am I assuming? What are you assuming for data set size? And that means not that you're prematurely optimizing and you're optimizing for the wrong thing. It's just that you document. This assumes that we get no more than 1,000 of these things. Great. Now, the next time you get to this algorithm and you're saying, oh, my program has changed, and now I'll get 1 million of them. Maybe I need to rethink this part. So to me, it's all about documenting what you assume and documenting the boundary conditions and the scale. Because optimizing for scale is something that needs to happen at every step of your program. So it's something about architecting the different layers, architecting the interfaces, architecting the APIs. And if you try from the get-go to build for 10 million entities, you will make it incredibly hard for yourself to get started. So it makes perfect sense to make simplifying assumptions, test out, figure out where you want to go, how this is all going to fit together, but then know that you made these assumptions and be willing to go back and say, oh, and now that I'm thinking this is all going to be so much bigger or so much faster or so much more complicated, what do I need to change in my architecture? And that's where we're having a development process that documents your steps and documents your assumptions really helps.
Cool.
One thing that I kind of wanted to dig into in this call, I'm going to totally change the subject. Sorry, Joe. Was how does a company like VMware think about open source? I mean, I've interviewed a whole bunch of people at larger companies like Microsoft. We've had people from Google and Facebook on this show to talk about some of the things that they're working on, Angular, React, because it's a JavaScript podcast. But how does VMware view open source, both in the way that you consume it and the way that you produce it?
Let me start out with my favorite pet peeve. I don't think you consume open source. You consume a commodity. You consume something where you don't really care where it comes from. I plug my what is the word in English for stecker? The end of my power outlet into the socket, and I get electricity, and I don't really care. I consume it. Mm-hmm. I open the faucet and water comes out, right? Open source software doesn't work that way. You use it. Ideally, you engage with it. You need to understand, as I said earlier, you need to understand these assumptions that were made. You need to understand what was the purpose it was actually designed for. What is the scale that the community that built it had in mind? So please don't consume open source software. Use it. Engage with it. Off my soapbox and actually answering your question. So I don't think there is any significant software product in the market today that doesn't include a ton of open source components. Open source software is truly ubiquitous, and everyone uses libraries, large and small, tools, components that are actually developed in open source. And that's a great thing. As a company, you need to establish the processes and the rules and the muscle memory of how to do this right. And this is a question of licensing. This is a question of understanding the viability of the components that you use, the fitness for your purpose. This is about security, about, again, scale and performance, about what are the assumptions. Am I using something that was initially built as a computer science 201 project and then abandoned 4 years ago and no one works on it? Or is this an actively developed project with a healthy community that pays attention to security, to bugs and whatnot? So is this the right component to use? Is this a viable component to use? So that's the use side. Understand what you're doing. Understand the context of how this software is developed. Understand the community enough that you're comfortable that in 3 years from now, the version that you're using is still supported, or there's an upgrade path, or this is still the same component to use. And then on the other side, this being a JavaScript podcast, I'll talk about Project Clarity. It's almost exactly a year ago that we open sourced that at VMware. And it's a design system for Angular-based UIs. And so why would a company open source that? It's very simple. It's not our core business to write design software. Our core business is to write enterprise software that needs great UIs. So how much time and effort we spend on creating this design system and how many people are able to contribute and to make it better has a direct impact on the quality of the UIs that we can develop. So for us, it was a very easy decision to say, hey, we created something that we think is pretty darn good. Now let's work with a broad community across many different companies, many different fields to help make it better, make it create better UIs, make it easier to use, create an open source project with the community around it. And yes, this cost us a bit more effort to get it right, to listen to feedback, to fix bugs. But on the flip side, we get so much more input, so much more help, so many more design professionals look at the software that the software gets so much better. And as a result, our UIs get so much better. So the logic behind open sourcing something like this is to get to better software quicker. Now you can apply this to many different tools that you and your company use internally. And you can always ask yourself, is this tool the differentiating thing that makes me a successful company? Or is this the tool that really just helps me create better software, and that if the tool got better, I would benefit? And then the complete other element that is really important in understanding when you would create open source software is when you're trying to create de facto standards. You're trying to create something that becomes an on-ramp into your ecosystem, where you want people to use certain API calls, certain libraries, certain functionality, because that then drives your business. So software libraries, software components that enable what you do, that make it easier for others to use your products. Those are also a great use case for open sourcing stuff.
So, Dirk, I've heard a number of people throw out interesting creative ideas about how to solve the problem on GitHub of open source projects that get abandoned from people getting burned out, of finding a way to avoid burnout, perhaps through making it easier for companies to contribute monetarily to these projects, or for individuals with micropayments. Do you have any creative input on opportunities that you see that GitHub could implement to help resolve this problem? Because I say GitHub in particular just because there's so much the center of gravity for open source today.
So I may be a naive fool, and many of my friends and coworkers would agree with that statement, but I don't think money is the real problem. I think burnout is a matter of simply too much work and too much perceived reward, or simply too much work. And a big part of that is something that many projects are moving towards, maintainer groups. So instead of having one maintainer that maintains a whole project, or if the project is bigger, that maintains a big module, have teams that work together, so that being gone for a few days, being on a dive trip and not reading your email is entirely feasible without the project slowing down, and that others can simply pick it up. And what happens once you wrap your mind around this setup, that it's not one person who decides, but it's a team of people working together, is that the size of this team will respond to the size of your project. So the higher the rate of contribution is, so the more work is there for the maintainers to do, naturally this group expands and more people will become involved, so that the workload for the individual stays maintainable. In my mind, that is a much better approach than trying to find a way how a few hundred or a few $1,000s are going to motivate this one individual to continue to work 80, 90, or 100 hours a week, because fundamentally working 80, 90, 100 hours a week isn't maintainable. So it really is about scaling your workload and not about giving somebody money.
Yeah, good stuff. I think the hard part is finding people that are, I suppose people that are committed enough to stay in for the longer haul, because there's certainly a ramp up time with any project. It's one thing for somebody to do a one-off pull request in an area, but you need a group of people that really have a cohesive knowledge of the project so that they can understand when a pull request should be rejected and why. or when a pull request runs fundamentally against the design of the application. But I, as somebody who's done some open source myself, I completely agree with you that the individual quickly feels very frustrated. I do agree with you that a team approach makes a whole lot of sense. I'd be interested, do you have any advice for people that are trying to build that team but are currently sitting on an open source project all by themselves?
I also want to set another trigger point, and that's just you feel like you're completely overworked trying to do it all, and you're not even thinking about building a team. Because I know a lot of open source folks like that too, where it's like, well, if I didn't have to work this full-time job, I could spend more time on this, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, scaling out a team may be a better answer.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
So I have this full-time job, and I maintain an open source project in my copious spare time that I apparently have. So I'm very, very familiar with all these thought processes. And interesting enough, the project that I'm the maintainer of Subsurface Divelog program just recently went to a group maintainer model for exactly those reasons, because I was getting burned out and it was getting too hard for me to do it. But I think the question really points to something that is, again, a little more generic than the question of how do I find the right maintainer. The question goes towards the fundamental question of how do I create a vibrant and interesting open source project? Because once you have an open source project that people are interested in, and you get a lot of people contribute one-liners and one-off patches, as you mentioned, in the law of large numbers says that there will also be some people who are more interested and who would be willing to contribute more and become sub-maintainers or co-maintainers. And so this all hinges on your ability to create a community that's inviting, a process that seems transparent and fair to people, a certain velocity in your project that people feel that the investment of time is worth it because in the foreseeable future, this will go to a new release and will be useful to the users. And again, I joke everything is about me, so let's use my project as an example. With Subsurface, that's exactly what we have. We have more than 10,000 users. We have a couple hundred people who have contributed 1, 2, 5, 10 patches. And we have a core team of, at this point, about a dozen people who contribute very actively. And about half of them have stepped up and said, yes, I will help with maintaining this. And we are distributed across time zones, some in Europe, some here. We are geographically distributed. We are distributed in, let's say, age and experience and focus areas across the project. But all this together creates a team that jointly can continue to maintain this, I think, for a long time without any individual burning out. And tooling and automation and all these things help. But fundamentally, it's the mindset behind the project that really makes the difference. Do you as a team believe in, we want to do this together, we want to do this in a way that invites others to join, we want to do this in a inclusive and friendly manner that when new people show up, they don't say, I don't want to talk to these people, they're scary, but they feel welcomed and they feel respected for their contribution, whatever it may be.
So what is it? What is it in the open source projects that make people really want to get involved? Is it you talked about diving for your open source, so is it that common interest, or is it, well, gee, a lot of people use this and I want to give back to, just throw a project out there, Babel or Node or something like that. Or what is it? How do you create that so that A, people have the interest, and B, they want to contribute because they feel like they have something to give?
I always think that fundamentally almost everyone starts with open source because they're scratching their own itch. So they have something here that they need. If I look at the projects that I personally get engaged with, it's either projects that I really use for their true value, their end user applications, or it's tools or libraries that I use in my project that don't quite do what I want, or that have a bug and I want to fix that bug. So I think there's always a self-motivation, a nearly selfish need in there. What makes this more complicated is that then the engagement of companies, if you think about bigger projects, where now suddenly someone pays you to work on this, which kind of twists the logic a little bit. But to come back to your question, so what makes a project gain developers, gain maintainers? I think it's this balance of doing something that is useful for a large enough group, and being a project that, in the way it is run, in the way the inner workings, this, as I said earlier, open source is a social phenomenon. It's about trust and relationships. It's about people interacting with each other. And if your project does a good job of that, if your project is seen as something that, even if you are not someone who uses the software that is a result of this every day or ever, that contributing becomes fun. So again, in Subsurface, we have one of our most active contributors is not a scuba diver. And we all keep saying, why are you working on this? And his response is, because it's fun, because I like working with this team of people. It's an interesting level of complexity. And hey, this is great. I can, even though I don't dive and don't need a dive log program. And to me, this is, quite honestly, to me, this is one of those signs that we seem to be doing it right. We seem to be able to attract people, not just because they get paid to do it or they need to use this, but because it's fun to work with us.
So my next question for you is, you've worked at some fairly large companies like Intel and VMware doing open source, and you've been involved in open source for a long time. A lot of people work in companies where they don't have a culture of open source, or they may work in a company where the culture is actually hostile to open source, right? We don't want to give any kind of competitive advantage to our competitors. I mean, even to the point where you brought up Clarity, right? Where it's a UI engine. It's not really what VMware does. So we open sourced it. But what if, VM Soft, your arch rivals go and use it, right? They don't want to give any kind of help to them. Is there a way to bring open source to a company that either doesn't get it or actively fights it?
Can I interject with a story?
Please.
Here, Chuck, right along the same lines. I worked for a company that worked in a very, very, very niche area of the medical space. Very niche. The software at the time that I worked for them was probably 8 years old. It was written in the very first version of Microsoft's ASP technology, not ASP.NET, ASP. I even refused to work on the overall project, that original project, because I didn't want to stagnate my skills. Unless they're going to update, I wouldn't work on it. So I worked on other things. But it was a condition of my employment that I wouldn't work on that main app. My boss was absolutely convinced that somebody was desperate to steal our code and launch a new company to compete with us. And I found that idea strange, mostly, to be honest, ludicrous. But I thought, this is kind of an applicable story, that that same fear probably exists in the minds of a lot of business owners out there, especially when it comes, then you just say open source says, hey, let's just make the software free.
I almost got my hands on that software too, Joe. Almost.
Yeah.
But yeah, so how do you combat that, especially as the companies get larger or there's more entrenchment?
I mean, in so many ways, that's the story of my life. I have done this at the companies that I worked at, and I have talked about this at conferences and as invited speaker at many, many other companies who just wanted to get a handle on how should we think about this? How should we engage in this? And to me, this has always come down to revisiting your assumptions about who your own software developers are, where the value is in your product, and what the opportunity costs are of what you do. So if you have a project or a product that is core to what you do, and that is legacy and old and complex and convoluted, and you know requires outdated versions of libraries, it may actually be really hard to open source that, and it may not be worth it. But on the flip side, if it's something that's ancillary, that is complementary to what you do, if it's something where you basically wish you could invest more in it, but you don't have the resources, if it is something that becomes a bridge between technologies, that could bring more people into a technology space in which you're selling your product. There are so many cases where, while there's always a risk that somebody takes your software and ends up using it in a way where you say, darn, I didn't want to enable that. But the opportunities that you're missing by not engaging with others are, in my mind, almost always so much bigger. And there is this underlying fallacy of thinking that the smartest developers are working here, and therefore, what could I possibly gain from getting others involved? And in reality, for any brilliant developer that you have in your company, there are 1,000 more brilliant developers outside of it. And so if you structure your thought process around what are my opportunities and what opportunities am I missing out on by trying to keep this software close. And it's a process. It's something that takes time. It's something that companies need to get comfortable with. And certainly going into a company and saying, hey, I want you to open source your core product, most likely not a very successful approach, because that's where all the revenue is tied up. That's where all the ownership, all the assumptions, all the sentiment is tied up. It's really, really hard. But if you have a company that is hesitant or maybe borderline hostile with open source, and you come in and you talk about what are the tools that you're using to create your test harness, to schedule your build, to go from a meta language to the actual code that you compile, tools to build components like Clarity, for example, tools for debugging, for testing. There are so many things that we all build around our core product to create our core product. And there are often so many opportunities to do things there in open source, which then create familiarity and comfort and the feeling, oh, maybe this isn't so scary. So what can we do next? And it's a journey. You will never be able to come into a company and just throw a switch and suddenly it's all open source. I mean, that's ludicrous. And that's really not what I'm after. I'm very much a pragmatist when it comes to open source. For me, open source is a fascinating way to create great software and to create it in a collaborative manner, in a very social manner. It is a very social thing. And I think it's very valuable in the right places. And there are places where it isn't, and where it isn't superior to what the industry has been doing for the last few decades. So take a pragmatic approach, look at the opportunities, and start small, start easy, and expand from there.
So one other thing that I'm wondering about, and this comes out of an interview that I did at Microsoft Connect. We were talking about some tools that Microsoft has that they haven't open sourced. You know, they've open sourced quite a few of them, but this particular tool they hadn't. And I'm not going to pick on the particular thing, but they talked a little bit about the software or the repository not really being in the right kind of shape for them to want to open source it, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It's a very familiar comment.
So I'm curious from that standpoint, in a company like VMware or some of these other larger companies, you know, where, you know, you've got something that really works, you know it works. What kinds of things do you have to do to a repository that already exists to make it so that you'd want to open source it?
Well, I apologize. I won't throw my coworkers under the bus, even though that might be fun. So I will not give you specific examples, but
we've all done these things. We've all done them. So yeah.
In the abstract, one of the things that I find, there are a couple of areas that I usually find when you look at repositories that were designed and implemented as proprietary software. One is the consistency of commit messages. You will see a repository that has 50 commits that say update, update, update. Then comes an important one, bug fix, update, update. No, maybe not perfect. Or you will have commits where a single commit brings in 64 different changes and touches 240 files. And its commit message says sync. Great, that helps me. So it's discipline, it's software engineering hygiene, it's very basic software engineering. The other area that very often is scary is comments. I think most of us are old enough to remember Star Office and Star Division, purchased by Sun, and then the decision to open source Star Office. One of the fascinating things was that Star Division was a German company, and the people who were open sourcing the software were Americans. And they didn't immediately realize that the sources that they were open sourcing contained a ton of German comments that, had they known what the comments actually say, they wouldn't have wanted associated with their brand. Because there was a lot of swearing, a lot of bad-mouthing of customers, a lot of questionable comments. This is something you need to be aware of. So is your code something that you're proud for people to look at? And then there are things that, and I find this highly ironic when you talk to software engineering teams, that sometimes your code contains shortcuts. Your code contains assumptions that you aren't willing to admit to. Your code does things that you would rather keep secret. And even if you come in as an open source advocate and you talk to them about, hey, let's open source this, they will come up with 1,000 different arguments why you can't open source that, instead of saying, you know what, actually, there are things in there we really would want to re-architect in order to maintain that perception that we are a competent software development organization. And obviously, none of this has happened at VMware because we are a very competent software development organization, just for the record.
I'll go out on a limb. I've done all those things.
Oh, me too. But I have written none of VMware's proprietary code, so we're not talking about me here.
Yep, absolutely. One other thing that I see a lot in open source that these companies seem ill-prepared for, or, you know, that they get somebody in that really gets it, and so they take a little bit longer to make sure they get it right, is managing the community around the software. You know, and we've seen missteps. I think we've seen missteps with, you know, React, with their licensing. You know, the transition from Angular 1 to Angular 2 was not exactly well presented. You know, there are other things out there where, you know, they're going in the right direction, but then, you know, they mess something up in the way that they interact with their community. How important is that for a company to consider, and what kinds of things do companies need to make sure they have in line for that before they go open source?
So I have somewhat mixed feelings around this role of a community manager. And I have very good friends who do that for a living. And I know that I'll become unpopular by saying this, but I think a community manager who isn't part of the developers, who isn't one of the people really involved, is more often a problem than a solution. Because yes, community is important, community management is important, but doing so as a separate function risks that you are actually disconnected from the true needs of the community. And it becomes this abstract thing, which I think in most communities isn't a good thing. And there are exceptions. There are dedicated community managers who are incredibly talented and are doing an amazing job. But way too often I see community managers who don't understand the needs of the developers in the project, and who look at all this with a marketing point of view, or with a brand point of view, or wherever they come from. What is their professional background? They're not software developers. Mm-hmm. Having said that, one of the biggest things to get it right when dealing with the community is this incredibly basic ability to say, oops, I got this wrong. you will make mistakes. Your company will make mistakes. Things will be pushed into the repository that shouldn't have been pushed. You will maybe even do force pushes and try to remove stuff. You will have statements made by your team that aren't okay. You need to be willing to own up to it and to say, hey, we did this wrong. Let's figure out how to do it better. And obviously, if you look at the political landscape today or the social landscape today in the US, a lot of people are learning that maybe saying I'm sorry is a pretty good skill. And it's especially true in something as highly social as an open source project, because the only way you're going to keep people around and keep people interested in working with you is if they feel comfortable, if they feel that you treat them fairly and you treat yourself the same way you treat everyone else. I'm not so worried about outbursts. I mean, there's everyone loves to pick on Linus. Linus is someone who sometimes gets rather outspoken, and it was just this week where he got on another rant about a proposed security approach in the kernel, and people get very upset about his tone. And to me, yeah, be nice, be productive, be polite, and that's all good and wonderful. But at the end of it, if the vast majority in the communication in your project is civil and technical and contained, and if the people who are on the receiving end of the occasional wild rant that happens are people who have been around and who know what they should have done and they didn't do it, and they didn't do it even though you told them 3 times, then going on a rant can actually be the human and the normal thing to do. And I'm not defending Linus for his tone or anybody else for that tone. And certainly abusive messages are never accepted. But I also think that a hyper-policed environment where you can never say, crap, that's stupid, because sometimes someone sends you a patch that is crap and that is really stupid. And so feeling that you aren't allowed to say that, I think is hurtful. And being able to slowly escalate the intensity with which you say something is wrong may be healthy for a project. But the biggest problem in all this is degree and measured increases of your response. And that's really, really hard to define what is the correct way to do it. I worry about people who say, oh, you can always just be super polite and every comment on a patch needs to start with, thank you for this great contribution. Because if that is your rule book, then those phrases become meaningless. And I think a big part of being socially acceptable and successful in a project is also to be authentic and to believe in what you say and to stand behind what you say. And yeah, sometimes I say things on my project that afterwards I say, I should have phrased that differently. And then I go back and say, oh, sorry. What I really wanted to say was this thing over there. And I think that's fair and that's okay.
I have more. Anyone else want to ask a question?
I feel like asking questions is not the best way to get you to say interesting things, though.
Just gotta let him talk.
You mean the more I talk, the more I get myself into trouble? Yeah, that is so true.
Like
so true.
The more compelling and fascinating the things that you say are, to be honest.
Yeah. Anyway, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask this last question. So
we have 20 more minutes.
We do, but we need to save some time for picks too. So the question that I have is, if I remember right, at VMworld, you all announced that you adopted, was it the Kubernetes API? Or they adopted VMware API? You're making a face like you have no idea what I'm talking about. I seem to remember an announcement.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
So you're talking about the Pivotal Container Services, PKS. And this is a project that we co-announced with Pivotal and Google.
Yeah.
We are building a product together with Pivotal that allows you to use the Kubernetes APIs in an environment that runs on top of a vSphere base.
Right. I had a similar conversation again talking about Cosmos DB with Microsoft, and they've adopted the MongoDB API for Cosmos DB, the Cassandra API, the Gremlin API. And so as you adopt these open source APIs, these open source systems, right, where you're not adopting the technology per se, but you're adopting some of the design patterns around it or the API patterns around it. How does that come about? How do you go about saying, oh, well, we like what's going on over here. We know people are using this, and we want to make it an option here? Because it's not directly bringing in open source software. It's just the ideas, right?
I can talk to what other companies are doing. For us, it is really bringing in the software. So we are truly shipping Kubernetes on top of embossed with Kubo as a glue layer between those two. And we are able to run Kubernetes, upstream Kubernetes, on our vSphere infrastructure.
Oh, nice.
And this kind of folds back to what I said earlier, where open source is great to create things that collaborate, to create APIs, to create quasi-standards. But sometimes it's harder to get all these production elements right. And so Kubernetes today assumes that you have a way to create persistent storage across your cluster, that you have a completely virtualized network environment. And Kubernetes makes a lot of assumptions about the infrastructure that it runs on. And if you take this to enterprise scale, to complex distributed environments, it's actually pretty hard to do that. And so we look at this as, we think the APIs are truly interesting, and we know from a lot of customers that they want to see these APIs in their data center. But we feel that it's pretty hard today to do so at scale, at enterprise quality. So we want to bring our enterprise experience and the strength of our infrastructure and the popularity and the capability of these APIs and bring it together. But to us, this doesn't mean that we re-implement these APIs in our own software, but that we use the open source project. And we have very similar. We have the vSphere integrated OpenStack as a product, where you run a somewhat opinionated distribution of OpenStack on top of vSphere, and are able to create large, scalable OpenStack clusters in an environment where the hardware is managed by vSphere, and all of our manageability tools, all of our planning tools, our accounting tools, all the things that we have developed for our customers over the last decade are available to you. But to your developers, what you see is an OpenStack API, and they don't care what sits behind it. And so we have to have this idea a few times where we take something that in the industry, our partners, the developers in our customer sites tell us, hey, we would love to use that, but it doesn't work at the scale that we would like it to use, or it doesn't integrate with the infrastructure that we have. And so we create these integrations as products. I am more skeptical of what I thought you said, which is you take an API that has been developed in an open source project, and you just take the API and you implement it in your proprietary product, because there you will immediately go into a forked world and into incompatibility hell. So that seems less interesting to me.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I don't know how that's all been set up over at Microsoft, but it's interesting to think, oh, we took this open source software and we made it work with our proprietary setup, so you can use all of our tools and all of their tools, and it all works. And that's really cool too. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks.
For you, the listeners of JavaScript Jabber, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
Corey, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, I'll start off with a pick. I had a YouTube video I watched a couple days ago that I really enjoyed from Fun Function Show, which is a great show every Monday morning on JavaScript, and it was a show on automated testing. And I just found out that the author of the show has also decided to go full time on it. So hopefully be seeing lots of good content coming in the future from them too. So I'll share a link, but that's my pick.
Awesome. Joe, what are your picks?
All right, so I got 2 picks for you. I recently played a board game for the first time that I thought was just fantastic. It's called Dice Forge, Forge. It's a typical type board game where you're playing against the other players, trying to score the most points. But it's got a very unique mechanic in that you have a pair of dice, and throughout the course of the game, you can buy upgraded faces for your dice, and you pop the face off your dice and one of your die, and you pop a new face on as you play the game and make your dice more powerful. It was pretty cool and I had a really good time playing it, so I highly recommend that one, Dice Forge. The other thing I want to pick, my other pick is going to be just the concept of empathy. Recently, I had a chance to do some empathizing with somebody who was in a really tough spot, and it just reminded me how important it is that we keep in mind what it is to actually have proper empathy for other people and the opportunity to actually sit in a difficult place with somebody else, not turn it around in any way, but just simply be there for somebody. So if you're not familiar with the concept of what empathy is and how it differs from, if you've never really studied the concept, I encourage you to take a moment to do some Googling and really understand empathy and learn it as a skill and practice it. It makes a huge difference. Those are my picks.
Awesome. Aimee, what are your picks?
Yep, I got 2. So the first one is just a really, really looks like a small but pretty helpful Chrome extension. It's called Z Context. So if you're trying to debug Z index issues, this Chrome extension is pretty helpful for seeing what stacking context you're in and stuff. So that's my first pick. And then the second one, I talked to a lot of developers, especially friends who graduated from boot camps, and it seems like so many of us have a hard time sleeping, and we didn't always have this. I know for me, sometimes it just takes me so long to fall asleep, and I'm not even stressed out or anything. It's just I can't explain why this happened when I started programming, but I'm not the only one, and it happens to so many people. So I'm always searching for different things to help me fall asleep. And so I found something the other day, just looking around, actually on Amazon, and it's called, hopefully I'm pronouncing this properly, it's called Dodow, Dodow. And it kind of it looks like it's kind of borrowing from meditation, but it's this little light that projects onto your ceiling, and you're supposed to watch the light, and it pulsates and stuff. And it's supposed to help lower your heart rate so you can fall asleep faster. So I ordered one. It was $60. It got great reviews. I haven't actually tried it out yet, but it got really, really, really good reviews. So hopefully it helps. Anything that helps is very valuable because sleep is important. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Now, my pick is going to be a little bit different than what I normally do. So I've been reaching out to people to get them on my JavaScript story. And when I reached out to some of our past guests, I had one of them reach back out, and he's been going through some stuff, and he's done quite a bit for our community. And so I'm just going to do something a little bit different, in that instead of picking stuff that I was like, oh, this week I played with this thing, his primary source of income right now is his book royalties. And I'm not telling you just to go buy a book, just support him, but go buy a book to support him. He's got some great ones. It's Nicholas Zakis is who's going through this stuff. We had him on to talk about ES6 and module loading and a bunch of stuff. And he's got some terrific books. So go buy the books because they're terrific. And just keep in mind that you're helping somebody out that's contributed to the community for a long time and is going through some pretty hefty health crap right now. So he has Understanding ECMAScript 6, Principles of Object-Oriented JavaScript, JavaScript for Web Developers, High-Performance JavaScript, Maintainable JavaScript, on and on and on. He's got a whole bunch of books out there. So I'm going to put a link to his author profile on Amazon, and then just go browse through the books and see if there are any of them that you think you might want. I'm sure he'd appreciate, the support and the ability to kind of give back to you while you give back to him. So anyway, that's my pick. Dirk,
can I? Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I actually echo that really quick? So I didn't know that you were going to pick that. And even before I went to my boot camp, when I was just learning how to program on my own by myself, I actually read one of his books. And for somebody who was literally just getting started and, like all I had was Stack Overflow and whatever books I ordered off Amazon, his book I felt like it was very in depth, but it was also like really approachable to somebody who was like, had a couple months of JavaScript experience teaching themselves. So I'm going to echo everything you just said, and I'll be quiet now.
And I wanted to help, so I just purchased his Professional Ajax 2nd edition book.
Oh, there you go.
It was $1.44.
Yep. All right, Dirk, do you have some picks for us?
Well, so my picks actually go kind of in the same direction that we heard earlier, which is ironic. So where I wanted to start with was practice critical thinking. And that sounds terribly abstract and useless, but we currently live in a world where a lot of people accept things just because people they like say them, or because they read them on the internet, and it must be true. And I think we see a severe lack of people actually questioning the sources they get information from. And this fundamental skill that I thought everyone should have learned in school, to hear a statement and then spend a few minutes to do your own research and figure out, is this actually true? Is this out of context? Is this irrelevant? Is this critical thinking, I think, is a skill that is massively underdeveloped. And if I can get everyone to spend a few minutes every day to ask more questions, that would be wonderful. And my second pick is also a board game. How funny is that? And it's Munchkin. I'm not sure if you've played it. Munchkin is one of those truly weird games. You play it the first time. The rules are so insanely overwhelmingly complex that you want to give up. And once you get into it, it is one of the most hilarious games, either with family or with friends, because so much of this game is designed around the concept of cheating and making up rules as you go and ruining things for the other people in the party. And it feels so like real life, but in a very lighthearted and beautifully illustrated and very humorous manner, that I think this is a wonderful thing to try. It has dozens of different extensions, but even the basic game is so hilariously funny and entertaining. That would be my pick, Munchkin.
Awesome. And then the last thing that I usually ask our guests is, where do they find you on GitHub, Twitter, blog, anything like that?
Almost everywhere you find me at Dirk HH. On Twitter, somebody else took this, so it's _Dirk HH. But on Google Plus, it's Dirk HH. On GitHub, it's Dirk HH. Wherever you go, even at VMware, it's Dirk HH to get to me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming and talking to us. It's
thanks
really
for having me.
To get this perspective. So, all right, we'll wrap this
show
up, and we will catch everyone next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.